Hey folks, welcome. So I've gotten several emails asking me about doing a video on flying ginormous scale airplanes. And I've done one similar to this in the past, but I'm going to try to do a little bit of a different twist on the way I do this video. Now, when I talk about ginormous scale, basically to me, folks, is if the airplane is basically over 8 feet of wingspan. I know that the old IMAA was over 80 inches, but to me, there's a lot of airplanes that are that size now. But one thing I want to make really clear is the bigger the airplane is, the easier it is to actually fly. When you hold the radio and you fly the airplane and you're looking at what you're doing, it's just so much easier on really big airplanes, okay? One of the things I want to dive into though is like, I look at the Bronco at 108 inches. It's a heavy airplane. I know in the specs they say 40 to 42 pounds. Mine's 48 pounds, and maybe it's because I went electric. But this is one of the greatest flying airplanes I've ever flown, and I'm not exaggerating, folks. It is just, it's on rails, it's predictable, it feels good on the sticks. It's just incredible, but it does have a couple of quirks I'll talk about a little bit later on in the video. But one thing I want to make really clear is, if you're worried about flying large airplanes, don't. There's a lot more that goes into these than just the skills that you need to fly them. If you can fly basically any model airplane proficiently, flying what I call ginormous scale, you're going to have zero problems with it, as long as you don't let it get into your head how much money you got in it. I have over $3,500 in the Bronco. Most of my ginormous scale planes, I always had over $3,000 in. One interesting thing about the Bronco, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, is it's one of the only RC planes I've ever flown that you really do need to use the flaps. I don't know if it's because it's heavy. It doesn't fly heavy. The cube wing loading, folks, is just in the middle of sport scale. But at 48 pounds, it is a heavy airplane. If you land it with no flaps, it lands like the Concorde. If you land it with one natural flaps, it's still pretty high. And if you land it with full flaps, it lands like a regular airplane. When I looked at flying the Emmaselle, when I first got into flying the Emmaselle, which was like my second ginormous scale airplane, you know, the Emmaselle 1, which I'll talk about in a minute, was my first ginormous plane. But this was my second. This was cleaner, and actually this had a lighter wing load, and it flew like a trainer. Okay, I kid you not. If you took a Goldberg, like, I'm showing my age. If you took like an Eagle 2 Goldberg or a high wing trainer, this plane flew exactly like that, and it flew like a 40 size trainer. And I had over 175 flights on it. The Emmaselle 1 I had over 1,350 flights on. But when you go to fly these big airplanes, folks, because they're so big, they're easy to see. They're easy and they're predictable. And the wind doesn't affect them like some of the smaller airplanes. And to me, I'm more relaxed flying these really big airplanes as long as you can get past that you're flying a $3,000 or a $4,000 airplane. I know the jet guys fly $15,000 planes, but still, that's a lot of money. When I look at the Emmaselle 1, this plane flew on the wing. Now, I'm not saying it was a hard airplane to fly. Once you had it up in the air and you're just cruising around at half throttle, it was like any other, well, actually, it was like a trainer. This had an extremely light wing load for its size. Huge wing, 197 inch. But one of the things was it flew on the wing. It only had 68 watts per pound. 68. You know, aerobatic and 3Ds have sometimes 200 or 250 watts a pound. Most sport planes have about 160. My Bronco has 160 watts a pound, and or 140 watts. I can't remember. I'd have to go back and look at the calculations. But flying the Emmaselle 1, folks, was much like flying a real aircraft. You needed to fly it on the wing, and if you put the nose up too high, it didn't have enough power to pull it through. If you let it go down the runway, get enough speed, you rotate it and you fly it, it was a joy to fly. It was a draggy airplane. If you pull the power back on it, it's going to slow down. And if you don't put the nose down, it's going to get really washy on you and be very difficult to fly. Now, some people watching this will probably go, but, you know, Damon, what about the other big airplanes? You know, this Flex airplane, Honestly, folks, it flies like a trainer. I mean, it's a foam plane. It's super light, way, way overpowered. And it's just super, super easy to fly. And one thing about RC planes now, especially these foam airplanes, they're way overpowered. This will go vertical out of sight at full power. I mean, it's just an incredibly flying airplane. But I don't technically call this a ginormous scale airplane. I mean, technically, folks, this Otter doesn't even meet the IMAA of an 80 inches. I believe it's only 75 or 74 inches. But it's a big airplane when people look at it, okay? But definitely not even giant scale. Same thing with my Cessna 170 I built with rockets on it, and which you don't want to put rockets, folks. I found that afterwards. The AMA and the FAA doesn't like you firing rockets from model airplanes. I believe it's only 60-inch wingspan. But people look at it and think, well, that's giant scale. That's technically not even giant scale, folks. Okay, but it is an absolute badass flying airplane, way overpowered. Now, it did kind of have a rough time after it went to Vietnam on an observation flight. It got hit by some AAA and got pretty screwed up. Had a crash landing, but the pilot survived, and it was a really, really sketchy moment, folks. You know, black ops, completely off the books, top secret. But the Otter did get repaired, and I'm sorry, the Cessna 170 did get repaired, and it's flying now. And the pilot has rehabbed. He spent a weekend on R&R with all the nurses, and he's got a big old grin and having a blast right now. But don't put rockets on your model airplanes, folks. Okay, it is flying again. One thing to think about: model airplanes, big ones, ginormous scale. The wingspan. Sometimes you'll be at events, folks, where your wings are so big it's hard to get it up and down the pits. Another thing is to think about how far you are from the flight line or the pilot station. Folks, I've been where I've had to carry my plane over 100 yards or drag my plane over 100 yards just to get to the flight station. So when you start building giant or ginormous scale or even giant scale airplanes, you need to think about the sheer size. Now, they fly great. Okay, absolutely the best flying airplanes you'll probably ever have as long as you've got the power to weight on it, correct. But there's a lot to think about in ginormous scale airplanes. Okay, and another thing, folks, is you've got to really consider, how do I get it to the field without damaging it, without getting hanger rash? Over 15 years ago, I bought this trailer, and it's been the greatest investment I've ever had. So far, I haven't built an airplane too big for it. But, folks, there's a lot that goes into building ginormous scale airplanes that you've got to take into account. You know, when I got my Otter, one of the biggest things was, how do I put it in the trailer where it's not going to get damaged? You know, when I think of my Bronco, when I think of the Otter, when I think of all of my aircraft, anything I'm going to get in there, how do I get it in there where it's not going to get damaged? I built these styrofoam and 3D printed stands for the Bronco that I can roll it back into the two rear ones, then lift the nose up and put it on the front one. And then I use Velcro and foam to hold it all in place. And this worked great. I went all the way to Ceph and back with it and didn't damage the airplane at all. The ABS that's printed into the shocks holds up fine in the heat inside my trailer, because I was really nervous about that, if they would get soft and sag. But you've got to figure out, how am I going to get my airplane from my shop or my garage or wherever you got it to the field without tearing it up? Okay, it's extremely important to consider. And folks, I thought these little 3D printed shocks I built was really wonky and cool, but they worked perfect. So I really lucked out there. I hit a home run with this system to carry the Bronco. Another thing to consider, folks, is how are you going to store the airplane when you're at the field? If you want to take it apart and put it back in your trailer, that's fine. But that's a lot of work, especially if you go to Ceph or some of these events. Like Ceph, I go for 10 days. I know the event's only 7 days, 7 days, but I go to some of these weekend fly-ins that are 3-day events or 2 days events, and it's easier to take a tent and pop it up and just store your airplanes in there like a hangar. And I do that every year at Ceph. And, you know, there's the Bronco. It's loaded up and ready for a sortie into Vietnam. And the 170 I converted into a bird dog. That's before it got all shot up and the pilot got shot in the thigh. Another thing about giant scale airplanes is, how do you check the CG? Folks, look at the piece of wood I'm using. It sagged when I hung this 48-pound airplane on it to check the CG. I'm also going to do a video in the future about how much your center of gravity changes when landing gears go up and down. When that landing gear goes up on the Bronco, you can tell big time. And I've trimmed out the airplane, you know, with the mixing. But when that landing gear goes up, that nose pitches up. Another thing you got to consider is your fans. How many people are going to want to walk around and look at your airplane when you're at these fly-ins? If you got ginormous scale airplanes or even giant scale, people like to look at them. They want to see them. Make sure you make them new fans, but be aware people are going to want to be around it all the time. Now what I want to talk about, folks, is if you got missiles and bombs on the bottom of the airplane, how do you lift it up when you're at the airfield so you can change your ordnance? And, you know, I love to build these stands, folks, because they just work really super cool. But if you're going to take your rockets and missile pods on and off, you got to figure out how to get to them. And I'm not saying you have to build stands to get to them, but when I made my 3D printed and aluminum stands, they are just absolutely kick-ass for taking on and off the ordnance on the bottom of your airplane. Another thing to consider is in your trailer, the space. When I go to CEF and some of these fly-ins, I bring all of my charging stuff, of course, tools and things to fix things. Okay, sometimes we beat up airplanes, especially when you send an airplane into like deep ops into Vietnam and it gets all shot up. You got to figure out how to get it back flying, right? And folks, I'm telling you, you will go to these things and always absolutely forget and leave something at home that's extremely important. Okay. One other thing I want to throw out there is these stands I made, they'll work on virtually any airplane. So I've made the little cups that go on all my aircraft. So if I need to get up in the air, a lot of times not just to do ordnance, but sometimes just to do work on the aircraft. I don't know how many times I've used my stands to put the plane up in the air so I can cycle the landing gear and I can, you know, make sure the gear doors are working right and just make sure all that's working. When you've got a 48-pound airplane, you just can't set it up in the air on a bench or something. Because if I put it on the travel things, it would run into stuff. But having it on the stands makes an absolute huge difference. And also, folks, another thing to think about is when you're figuring out how to get all of this into your trailer, and you're going to get in and out, you're going to have different airplanes. You need to have different configurations. If you notice in this configuration, my Otter's on the floor instead of up on the mid-deck because I'm bringing my jet with me to the field on this particular trip. And lastly, folks, you need to understand when you come back from a fly-in or CEF, you're going to have a garage just completely that goes to ape shit full of all the stuff that you took there. And you need to understand it's going to take you a couple of days. I know you want to decompress. I drive 10 hours back, but then I end up with this garage full of all this crap. And I got to figure out where it's going to all go back and live until I go to the field again. Sometimes I just leave it in the trailer. Sometimes I hang it on the wall of the garage. Sometimes I move it down to the basement. But you need to understand logistically, if you end up with a bunch of giant scale and ginormous scale airplanes, how are you going to really store that stuff? Very important, okay? So I hope you like this video. I hope it answers more of your questions, folks, because realistically, flying these are not hard at all. That's the greatest part of it. But owning them, storing them, the logistics can be the biggest pain in the ass in the world, okay? Rock on, folks. Have a great day. Take care, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.